Perfect. I'm sorry about that. I'm not quite sure what happened. I had a little issue with my mic. All right, let me just start from the beginning then. I'm going to talk today about flipped classrooms and how closely related they are to critical thinking. And I also wanted to share some of the benefits I've learned for the classroom, both for me as a teacher and also for my students as a result of flipped classrooms. So I first began thinking about flipped classrooms when they started garnering more and more attention and were being used more and more prevalently at varying levels of instruction. Because flipped classrooms enhance critical thinking, which is a skill set so necessary to 21st century learning, flipped learning became really important to me as an ESL teacher. So this webinar will give you kind of an overview, just a definition of flipped learning, show how it incorporates critical thinking, and then again, I want to share some of the benefits that I've discovered since I started flipping my own classroom. So to begin, I thought I'd better just share a definition of flipped learning. When I first started flipped learning, I have to admit I wasn't quite sure exactly what it is. So the definition I'm going to share with you comes from the Flipped Learning Network. And they define flipped learning as a pedagogical approach in which direct instruction moves from the group learning space to the individual learning space. And the resulting group space is then transformed into a dynamic, interactive learning environment where the educator guides students as they apply concepts and engage creatively in the subject matter. That is a little difficult to wade through. So if I were to translate that, I would say that learning usually done in the classroom becomes homework. Homework usually done at home then becomes the classwork. Lectures and direct instruction are now done by the student on his or her own. Class time is spent actually using the material rather than simply comprehending the content. And class, as a result, is a lot more interesting, and students actually make more advances in their English skills. So essentially, the first two bullet points on this slide are probably what you had heard most about flipped learning. It certainly is what I had heard most about flipped learning. And that was basically that students kind of watch videos which have the lectures or the class content, and they do that outside of class, and then when they come into the classroom, they do that what used to be homework. Well, a lot of that's true, but it's a little more than that. And one thing that I was very surprised to learn was that the letters in FLIP actually stand for something. So basically the F stands for flexible environment, the L for learning culture, the I for intentional content, and the P for professional educator. What some people don't realize is that each of those things has some specific components that we need to think about, and each of these affect the classroom in different ways. So if we were to look at each of them separately for just a moment, the flexible environment, what does this mean for our classrooms? Well, students choose when and where they do the learning. They don't have to do it at 8 a.m. when they're sitting in your classroom. They have a lot more flexibility with that. Students interact and reflect on their learning more often, and students are provided with different ways to learn and master content. In other words, students can study early in the morning, they can study late at night, they can read or listen or take notes as many times or as few times as they want. It really doesn't matter. The content is always available to them, and it doesn't disappear as the spoken word does when the teacher stops talking. This also helps me because I'm a morning person. I'm always the person teaching that 8 a.m. class, but a lot of my students aren't the same morning person I am. So if they want to study late at night when I'm sleeping, this method works great for that. And of course, the flexible environment is closely related to the L in FLIP. The L stands for learning culture. Now, how does this affect our students? Actually, students get to explore the topics in much greater depth. They're much more actively involved in the learning. They participate and evaluate their learning so that it's more personally meaningful to them. Students become central to the classroom, and materials are actually a lot more accessible for them. Now here at Stanford University, where I teach, and across the United States, the student-centered classroom is vitally important to the ESL class. Students need to be busy and active. They shouldn't be passive or bored. And by using this learning culture, students learn a lot more about whatever topic you're teaching them. Rather than learning just a little bit about a lot of things, they learn a lot about a lot of things. As a result, students are advancing further both academically and professionally. This helps them outside the classroom. And I think we all have the same goal. We want our students to succeed beyond academia. We want them to be able to succeed in whatever careers or jobs they choose. The I in flipped learning stands for intentional content. So what does this mean for the student? Well, the content for class has been carefully selected by all of us. I mean, there is a reason that we teach what we teach. Now, I want to talk more about flipped learning and why we flip. And that has a lot to do with critical thinking. So I'm going to talk about that a little more in a minute. But basically, when students leave their home schools or they graduate from a university, they need to be able to do more than just memorize the content and take multiple choice tests. They actually have to be able to critically think and use the skills that we're teaching them outside of the classroom. And now I'll briefly just touch on the professional educator, which is what the P stands for in flipped learning. I think a lot of people think that flipped classrooms replace the teacher, but they actually don't. In fact, I argue that the teacher is even more important to the flipped classroom. You as a teacher are able to give faster and more thorough comments more often, and therefore students actually progress further and faster. So breaking this down into the simplest terms, there are two big ideas behind flipping your classroom. And the two big things we need to do is whatever was homework in your classroom becomes classwork. And whatever was classwork actually becomes the homework. That's the most basic definition of flipped learning. But the second big idea behind flipped learning is that we actually flip Bloom's taxonomy. And that's what's most important, because we have to take what we do in the classroom and make sure that students can actually use what we're teaching them to do. That's why you really want to flip your classroom, to make sure that students actually use the English outside the safe haven of our English classrooms. So to touch on Bloom's taxonomy, and this is something I think we all need to think about whether or not we decide to flip our classroom, is this. I know most of you are all familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. It's something we all had to study when we were learning to be teachers ourselves. On the left is the original Bloom's taxonomy that Bloom created in 1956. It has been slightly updated, and you can see that in 2001. The big differences are that they swapped the top two levels of Bloom's taxonomy, and they also converted the nouns into action verbs. Now, we can work with critical thinking at all levels of English teaching. But what we need to do is make sure that students actually use these higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. I, for one, never had enough time to really move beyond the first two levels of Bloom's taxonomy. By the time I taught students what they needed to know, I taught them whatever English concept I was teaching. I made sure students understood it. I was then out of class time. Students didn't have enough time to ask questions. They didn't have enough time to assign activities that would allow students to actually critically think, to apply, analyze, evaluate, create, synthesize, etc. This is when I began my research and writing some materials on flipped classrooms. and this was a really great strategy to help me develop critical thinking, was to actually flip my classroom. Because when we flip our classroom, we also flip Bloom's taxonomy. So let's think about critical thinking a little more, because that will help us decide what should be homework and what should be classwork in a flipped setting. So Bloom's taxonomy is divided into what I call lots and HOTS. LOTS stands for lower order thinking skills, and HOTS stands for higher order thinking skills. When I'm picking out a textbook or when I'm planning my lessons, I think it's really important to look at the books before we adopt them and think about our lesson plan, whether or not we decide to flip our classroom. So I spend a lot of time, writing my materials, creating my lesson plans, and looking for books that contain all different question types in the books. Now, all of the textbooks include a lot of lower order thinking skill questions, such as those listed to the left of my chart on this slide. We always test students on their comprehension of whatever we had them read, whatever we had them listen to, and often we teach these in class. But we as teachers also need to make sure that we move beyond just those lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So we need to look for question types in our books or our lessons that help students make that transition into application and analysis. I've listed some samples here: solving, using, examining, analyzing. Questions or activities that include those skills help our students move up Bloom's taxonomy. Obviously, there are many more. And then obviously, we all want lessons and books that include the highest of thinking skills on Bloom's taxonomy, those higher order thinking skills. And some samples are listed to the right on the chart here: construct, formulate, propose, or recommend. Flipping our classroom lets us reach those higher levels. It makes sure that our students can do skills from all of the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Now, to give an example, if my listening students were listening to a passage about a marketing strategy, some sort of business for English type lesson, I would, of course, make sure that they understood what I had them listen to. I'd have them make an outline. I'd have them list the steps in the marketing strategy. But then I want to move higher. I want to have them analyze what was good or bad about the strategy. I might have them compare the strategy to different advertisements they've seen. And lastly, I'd have them create their own product and write a marketing plan, making sure that I incorporate those higher order thinking skills that really promote critical thinking in the classroom, all the while still teaching English. Now, there's some really fabulous textbooks out there. You can do this with any textbook, but if you want some great books for flipping your classroom or for promoting critical thinking, make sure you check out Prism or Final Draft or Unlock. Those are some great series that incorporate critical thinking and make flipping your classroom really, really easy. Now, it does go a little beyond just question words. Here I've listed some lower order thinking key phrases as well as higher order thinking key phrases. But if your textbooks and your lesson plans include those on the left side of the slide, then you're making sure that students understand what you've taught them. If you also include question types and activities from the right side of this slide, then you're also making sure that your students are moving higher into the critical thinking realm, moving higher into Bloom's taxonomy. We want to make sure that we can use them both. Now, how is this tied to flipped learning? This is Bloom's taxonomy in a traditional classroom. This is from a book called Flip It, and this book has some simple strategies for beginning, easy ways to begin flipping your classroom. But essentially, this is a traditional classroom. And in this traditional classroom, we're teaching the content, and students are, mastering these lower level and easier skills in class. And then we send them home to use the material and actually use the higher level skills at home on their own. Their homework that we give them are from the higher level of Bloom's taxonomies, right? It's where we ask them to apply something or analyze something. Or I'm afraid sometimes maybe we also just send them home with more homework from the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy. You've probably heard the term sage on the stage associated with flipped learning. In a traditional classroom, you have a sage on the stage, and that is where the teacher stands in front of the room and teaches the concept. Students listen, and then they go home to attempt these higher level skills on their own. Well, in a flipped classroom, we actually flip Bloom's taxonomy. This is associated with the other term you often hear associated with flipped learning, guide on the side. Here, the students actually do the easy stuff on their own. They read the content on their own. They read the charts in the book. They do the simplest types of activities on their own as homework. Then when they come into class, we actually work on activities that are higher on Bloom's taxonomy: application, analysis, synthesis, evaluation. Thus, once you flip your classroom, students move higher into critical thinking. This is what we need to do to make sure our students get those 21st century skills that are so important to the flipped classroom. Now, since I have flipped my classroom, basically flipping Bloom's taxonomy, making sure that whatever homework I give them is of the easiest levels, and then working with them in my classroom on the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, I've discovered there's been a lot of benefits. Of course, critical thinking and having my students move higher on that critical thinking scale is a huge benefit. But I think there's some other benefits to flipping your classroom as well. And the first is that students have a much higher caliber of work. The quality of what they're doing is so much better. I'm using my writing class here as an example. Of course, this is a benefit to students, but I think it's a benefit to us as teachers as well. The students are happier because they're getting better grades. But I think we're doing a better job as well, because the student who's struggling with English is actually doing much better in the classroom. They're producing English at a better quality and better quantity. So using my writing class as an example, in a traditional classroom, I taught whatever I would need to teach. So say, for example, I was teaching students about persuasive essays. I would teach them what, the parts of a persuasive essay, how they write it, the different parts, what goes in each paragraph. And then I would send them home, and their homework would be to apply that and actually write a persuasive essay. Well, the essays I received were typical of what we all receive from, a first draft or a student who's attempted to write on their own. But when I flipped my classroom, I had students read about the persuasive essay on their own. Then when they came to class, we actually tried to apply it. We started writing first drafts in class. By doing this, they could help their peers. I was there to help. We could look at authentic materials, and I was there to assist them. And so the drafts turned out much better, thereby producing an improved caliber of work. I couldn't do this before I flipped my classroom. The second benefit I'd like to share, slightly related to the first one, and that's about better grades, but more importantly about transferability. A big part of our job is to make sure that students can succeed outside of our ESL classroom, that they can take the skills that we're using and use them in their other classes. At my university, my job is to make sure that they can succeed in their biology, engineering, science, math, literature, history classes. And I was afraid my students in my ESL class were only seeing the skills I was teaching as useful for my classroom. We need to make sure that students can use these things outside of our flipped classroom. So for example, in my reading class, I would teach skimming and scanning. And students would do a great job. They would skim or scan whatever I asked them to skim or scan. But I don't think they ever saw that as transferable to using that on materials outside of the English classroom, or being able to use skimming and scanning to work in the professional workplace. So, to use that reading classroom as an example, what I would do, rather than have them practice on ESL material in the classroom, I'd have them practice that on their own as the homework. And then in class, I would have them apply the ESL skills and strategies to other materials. My students in some of my classes are already matriculated into the university, so I made sure that they brought their textbooks from other classes, and that way they would be able to see how what we're teaching in the ESL classroom is useful to them outside of the ESL classwork. The third benefit I'll share is just student engagement. Clearly this is a benefit for the students because they're a lot more engaged in the classroom. But it also made me enjoy my classes a lot more. I'm using grammar as an example here because I found that my own grammar classes were getting rather dry. I would basically teach whatever grammar I had to teach from the book. We'd look at the grammar charts and we'd practice. But students didn't ever really apply the grammar. They didn't see how it was relevant outside of the ESL classroom. So students did that on their own. I'd have them read the grammar charts on their own. And of course, I still check their comprehension on a quiz when they came into class. That's also a way to make sure that they're doing the homework. A really big question I get all the time is, how do you get them to do the homework? Well, I still give them a quick quiz when they come in to make sure that they did the homework. But to give an example of something I've done with my grammar class is when I'm teaching verb tenses, rather than just having them practice with fill in the blank and complete the sentence and pick multiple choice which form of the verb is right, we actually talk about situations or have debates, or we talk about a court case. And one time I actually, we did a kind of a criminal case in my class where each student took on a role. We had policemen and lawyers and witnesses, and they had to describe what part of the crime they had seen. Thereby, they had to use all past tense. They didn't just have to pick out the past tense from a multiple choice activity. They actually had to use the grammar. And that way, students are a lot more engaged in the class. The fourth benefit I'll share is about a level playing field. And I think we've all been in the same boat before. I'm using my listening class as an example here. But basically, I was playing the audio in class. And what I would do at the end is I would ask if everyone understood. Well, of course, I got really, really mixed reactions, right? About a fourth of my class would say they did understand. About a fourth would say they didn't understand. About a fourth wouldn't answer me at all. And then about a fourth, might even lie to me and say they understood because they didn't want to lose face in front of their peers. As a result, some students would do very well with the comprehension activities, but others would struggle. Now, a lot of my students are driven to be the very best, and when they're not, it hurts their confidence and they lose face. None of this is helpful to us as ESL teachers. But when you flip your classroom, you actually move a lot of the listening outside of the classroom. That way, students can listen as many times or as few times as they want to answer the basic comprehension questions. Then they can all participate actively in whatever I plan that day. And no one ever has to know if they listened 1 time, 3 times, or 5 times. The fifth benefit I'll talk to you about is increased student confidence. My students got so much more excited and emboldened after I flipped my classroom. One of my biggest struggles is getting the students to actually use the spoken language in my speaking class. I think this is in part because, they go home and they have roommates who speak their native language, so they don't practice the English outside the classroom. So my, 80 minutes of class is the only time they actually speak English. One of my classes teaches a lot of functional English. How to talk to students, how to greet other students, native speakers. how to give compliments, how to give advice. And a lot of my students were sounding like the dialogues that were in some of their textbooks. Well, I wanted them to actually talk to Americans. I wanted them to actually be able to use the language that I was teaching. And so one of the textbooks I use has contact activities where students are supposed to go out and talk to Americans. Well, that's what used to be homework before I flipped my classroom. Well, that's really hard. It's very hard for students to go out and actually talk to Americans. But when you flip the classroom, I had them read the sample dialogues on their own. But then we would do the contact activities together. I would send them out during class time for 15 minutes with a partner or a group to actually talk to Americans. And then that helped them because they were doing it in a group and actually using the language. The sixth benefit I'll talk about is the personalized attention and the humanized classroom you get for flipping your classroom. If we revisit the two phrases I mentioned earlier, a sage on the stage is your stereotypical lecturer, but a guide on the side is the teacher who now has the ability to get to know the students and their work much better. I realized that no matter how interactive my course was, and ESL classes are very, very interactive, I was still the ESL teacher and the students were still the students. Once I began flipping, you actually present less information in class, and my class time was spent roaming the room, helping individuals, sitting with groups, moving from one student to another. I was able to deliver more personalized attention to my students. So using my vocabulary class as an example, a student struggling with one of the words may ask, and I may have had to stop the whole class to answer a question about a particular word. Or students may not ask the question, if they don't understand a word. But in the flip setting, where they've looked at the words and studied the definitions and memorized them on their own, here I got to help students individually, and they could all ask their questions of me individually. And since I was getting to know the students better, I could personalize the questions I was giving them, or the answers I was giving them. So we had the word scrimmage one day in class, and a student who I knew loved sports, I could answer that using football as an example. But another student who didn't know that, I knew them well enough to know that I could give them a different example. The students were now able to ask questions about the vocabulary that they might have been too embarrassed to ask before. Plus, before students would come to class, sometimes they would greet me, sometimes they would talk to me, but I was still more this there was a status issue where students were more fearful of talking to me. But in a flip setting, because you get to know them better, they ask so many different questions. So I'm running out of time, and I want to make sure I leave some time to answer some questions. So I'll just share my last benefit, and that is time. Having flipped my class has saved a tremendous amount of time in 3 different ways. First, class time is much better managed. Going back to my listening class as an example, and I mentioned playing the audio, well, sometimes a 5-minute video might take 5 minutes if I just play it once. But I'd usually have to play it twice or 3 times to make sure everyone understood. In that traditional classroom, I ran the risk of running out of class time to accomplish my objectives, and I certainly didn't move my students higher on Bloom's taxonomy. But flipping the listening manages my classroom time better because they're able to listen as many times as they need to outside of class. Student time is also better managed. My students soon realize that they actually spend far less time on the homework because it's the easier work for them to do. They're doing those 2 lowest levels of Bloom's taxonomy. They also soon realize that it takes a lot less time to read about the lesson than it is to actually do the homework. And again, using that persuasive essay as an example, much easier for them to do the practice activities associated with persuasive essays than to actually write the persuasive essay. When I flip my classroom, students work on that persuasive writing when they're actually with me. And then selfishly, I think ESL teachers, we're really busy people. We have a lot we have to do. So we can all use some more time. And having flipped my classroom, having flipped that homework and flipped Bloom's taxonomy, I would have flipped a long time ago had I realized how much time I'd save. First, the time I spend grading is cut. There's two reasons for this. First, the homework I'm assigning is easier to grade because it's the comprehension level work, multiple choice, sentence completion. And also, the teacher's manuals have a lot of the answers, so I don't have to worry about that as much. Now, I do still have to grade my essays, but because we've done some of the writing in class, it's actually easier and takes less time to grade those essays. That caliber of work is better. So, the other thing to consider is how frequently students get assessment. It used to take me a lot longer to grade essays, which meant students had to wait longer to receive the assessment. Flipping the classroom got them their assessment back quicker, and they then could start correcting their mistakes faster. So I wish I had more time, so I'll just really quickly summarize here, but I'll be happy to answer some questions or share my email address if anyone wants to send questions. But why should we flip? Well, flipping makes it a lot easier on all of us. But most importantly, it enhances critical thinking by flipping Bloom's taxonomy, thereby providing a skill set for 21st century success and offering just a wealth of benefits for teachers and students alike. So I'll just leave this last slide up here for you. These are some great resources and websites that might be helpful, including the critical thinking community. If you're more interested in learning just more about critical thinking, that has all the features of a good critical thinker. The Flip Learning Global Initiative has just created some Flip Learning standards that might be a good reference, and of course the Flip Learning Network. And then on the right side, I've listed some books, the Anderson and Bloom book, which is all about Bloom's taxonomy, Littman's article on critical thinking, and then some of my own work on critical thinking and how to flip your classroom very easily, as well as focusing on the ebook. That last ebook is more about kind of debunking some of the myths about flipped learning. I think that still leaves me with some time for questions, and I've seen a couple of them pop into the chat box, so I'm going to try and address as many of those as I can. And the first question I see is, how do I deal with students who don't participate in the homework? And that's a really common question. And I have several different strategies I use for that. The first being that one thing I've done is I don't actually tell my students that I flip the classroom. I think if you tell students about flipped classrooms and they hear that they have to learn certain material on their own, I think they panic about that. But instead, I just give them the homework. I think to some degree students expect the homework, and I can adjust the homework. Once students realize that the homework is easier in the flipped classroom because it's multiple choice, it's sentence completion, they actually don't mind the homework. It also really helped me because I used to teach in an adult ed setting, and I needed to make sure that my students who are adult students and have jobs and children could manage the homework. Homework actually takes a lot less time in the flipped setting. Plus, there's just so many different ways you can do it. I can have my students watch a video. Students actually like to watch the videos, so it's not often as hard as you think to get the students to do the homework. Another common question that I've seen pop up in the chat box is about using technologies and videos to flip your classroom. That was actually one of my biggest fears, and it's part of the reason I actually started researching and debunking some of the myths. My little ebook on flip learning debunks that as one of the myths. So here at Stanford, I teach a lot of engineering students. And part of the reason I decided to flip my classroom is because all of the engineering professors here at Stanford were flipping their classrooms. And if I needed my students, part of my job is to make sure students can succeed at the university. If that's my job, then I also needed to make sure that they knew English, but they also needed to know how to survive in a flipped setting, and that flipped setting is full of interaction. So that's why I decided to flip. But I most certainly did not want to start creating my own videos. I am not a tech-savvy person, and I also just don't really like to be on video. I didn't want to see my own face on video. So you can absolutely find other ways to flip your classroom. Now, I also write a lot of textbooks, so I'm a big proponent of textbooks. So you can absolutely keep your textbooks and flip your classroom. And I mentioned some books earlier, the PRISM series, the Final Draft series, both of those are by Cambridge. Those make it really easy to flip because they contain all the levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And so you just need to choose carefully which activities you move outside of the classroom. So I flip with all of my textbooks. Whatever classes I had a textbook for, I kept my textbooks. You can use videos if you want. I don't use my own videos often. I use other people's videos. There's some really good YouTube channels that have made it easy for me. I can use other people's material. I also use PowerPoint slides. Sometimes I just use audio. For my listening class, what they're using outside of the classroom is just the audio that came with my textbook. So there are many, many ways to flip besides just using technology. Another question is how a flipped classroom prepares students to transfer their skills to other classes or to professional settings. Well, I think it does because students are using a higher level of Bloom's taxonomy. A lot of my students were accustomed to simply memorizing whatever they were told to memorize and then taking a multiple choice test. But unfortunately, in other classes, especially upper level classes, and in a professional setting, life is just not full of multiple choice tests. Life is full of discussion and debates and analysis and comparing things. I mean, I kind of wish my life were just a multiple choice test because then I could memorize everything. And so in a flipped classroom, when you're in the classroom with the students, they're not just stuck at the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy, which is that memorization and understanding. They're doing activities and discussions that require them to use those higher level skills, and those are the same skills they'll have to use in other classes or in professional settings. I'm not sure if there's other questions. I'm sure I probably missed some of them, but I would be happy to stay in touch. You can find me at Stanford, and you find my email address is rbrinks@stanford.edu, and I'll be happy to stay in touch. It's something, flipping my classroom has been so beneficial to me and to my students. Oh, I see a couple questions about the textbooks that I mentioned. PRISM is one. Final Draft is another. Unlock, which is another Cambridge series. And I've seen a couple of people ask about the making contact activities. That's actually from a book called Speaking in Social Context. And it's for a class I teach that's on more functional English. I've learned that my students, when they got here, they were not really prepared to talk to native speakers. They had kind of memorized all of those dialogues that we taught them, the hello, how are you? And so that's a textbook that teaches them more about what they're really going to hear in a native speaker setting, and then has these little contact activities that are so easy for students to do. It really builds their confidence because they actually go out and use the English. So that's Speaking in Social Context. Oh my gosh, I'm sure I missed some other questions. Well, please, again, stay in touch. My email address, you can find me at Stanford University. It's rbrinks@stanford.edu. And I believe Cambridge is going to post the slides, so you'll be able to see my references there. And stay in touch. It is the best thing I ever did, so I hope you all will at least give flipping a try. I certainly wish I had more than 30 minutes to really give you a better in-depth look at flip learning.